Okay, good evening. We're going to get started again. Can everyone hear? So, can everyone hear me now? Yes. Okay. So, good evening and welcome to this first panel of this really exciting program. This is called Revisions and Inversions, Modern Latin American Art and Sexuality. Now, my name is Jesus Escobar, and I am the Morrison Professor in the Humanities at Northwestern University. As a queer scholar who does not work directly on queer topics, and one whose research falls in a period prior to the naming of the word homosexual, I have to say that it's a special honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Jonathan. And so my status tonight is sort of outsider, insider, but I think we can all understand that. We all live that. I'm also a former chair of the Department of Art History at Northwestern, where I think Thad will agree we are trying to queer up the field right now. But I would say that it is no exaggeration that we have no PhD alum of our department who has a more distinguished career as a public scholar and a queer activist than Jonathan Katz. So we are deeply proud of you, Jonathan, and I want to say congratulations to you and to Johnny and to the exhibition team for bringing this incredible project to this great city of Chicago. Yes. So although the topic of my scholarship falls in a period earlier than what's covered in the exhibition, my current research is largely situated in Latin America, and it's to that region of the world that we'll now turn. So this evening, we will hear 3 papers exploring relations between modern art and sexuality in Mexico, the Andes, and the Southern Cone, the very cone that Joaquin Torres Garcia famously inverted in the 1950s. And Torres Garcia argued that the South was the North, and in so doing queered our understanding of the avant-garde. And it was a move that inspired debates that continue to this very day. So for this panel, I will introduce each of our speakers as they take the podium. Please reserve any questions that you might have about the presentations until all 3 have spoken, and we will have a Q&A at that time. So let me get started. Our first speaker is Esther Gabara. Dr. Gabara is Professor of Romance Studies and Art History, and Visual Culture at Duke University. She is the author of Errant Modernism, The Ethos of Photography in Mexico and Brazil, Duke University Press, 2008, and Non-Literary Fiction, Art of the Americas Under Neoliberalism, University of Chicago Press, 2022. She's also no stranger to curatorial work, and I'll only highlight one example. She served as the mastermind for Pop America, 1965 to 1975, an exhibition whose venues included the Block Museum of Art here in Chicagoland on the Northwestern campus in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gabara.
The next slide.
Okay. Oh, well, I didn't realize I'm going to do some technology in here. Sorry.
Let me know if you need anything.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here. I think I'm really honored to be part of this. So I'm going to see if this...
Yep, there you go.
There we go. Okay. It's been so much fun to be part of this and to collaborate with Jonathan and Johnny and everyone else. So thank you for having me here. And I through this title, The Soul of the Boy with a Question Mark, Modernity and Sexuality in Greater Mexico. And I'll start with this image because I love it so much. So many stereotypes dominate outside perceptions of Mexican masculinity, homophobia, and misogyny that it's difficult to rescue the complexity and contradictions that have shaped sexuality and gender in the country in the modern era. Within Mexico, however, a significant scholarly and popular literature has located queer writer and public official Salvador Novo, 1904 to 1974, at the center of the modern history of the nation. This portrait of Novo by painter Manuel Rodriguez Lozano has been the crux of many, many analyses. We see the poet and later official chronicler of Mexico City perched in the interior of a car, from which he nonetheless appears to look from above at the street corner and taxi stand referenced in the subtitle of the painting, which is not here, sorry about that. I mentioned it in the subtitle. Novo, known for his sardonic wit and dramatic self-presentation, arches a painted eyebrow at the viewer over a dropped shoulder, his slender figure barely filling the dark blue bathrobe loosely tied around his waist, Full painted lips and aquiline nose emphasize the sitter's regal attitude and stand in contrast to the working class drivers working the street. Rodriguez Lozano fills the canvas with such contrasts. The dark night sky with the glowing lights of the taxi stand, the intimate interior and public street, and the drama fills the painting with an erotic charge, reminding the viewer of Novo's well-known sexual encounters with taxi and truck drivers. He actually contributed to a taxi and popular journal publication of the taxi and drivers so that he would have this contact with them. It's no accident that Lozano chose Novo as the subject for this portrait, given his elaborate and public performances of radical ways to live, communicate, and represent sexuality. What makes Novo so crucial for any exploration of this word, homosexuality, in Mexico is not only that he was not closeted, but that his openness about same-sex desire coexisted with his presence as a literary and public figure of great regard. The public nature of Novo's sexuality allows us to rethink not just stereotypes about Mexico, but broadly about still dominant ways we think about modernity, progress, and liberation, sexual and otherwise. As in Europe and the United States, in Mexico, sexuality was a site where modern identities, scientific discourses, communications, and social relations were projected and imagined, as much as a canvas for experimentation and the development of a modernist aesthetics. The premise of this exhibition, though, presented me with something of a conundrum. The first homosexuals, and Jonathan knows I got nervous. Because from the perspective of the global South, claims to firstness are often frustrating. Not just a geopolitical term, the global South references the sites that start the race toward modernity from behind a starting line that is always somehow placed so that Paris, Berlin, and New York arrive first. As Rafael de la Esa writes, quote, an evolving project of modernity has been linked to particular constructions of sexualities. So that modernity and sexuality bind is one that gives us pause. A concrete example may help. Paul Gilroy writes in a foundational book that European philosophies are often proclaimed as the first to affirm modern concepts such as individual liberty. Their firstness only can be believed, Gilroy showed us, if we avert our eyes to the lack of freedom for people of African and native descent enshrined in the laws grounded by those very philosophies. Thinkers including Gilroy, Aníbal Quijano, María Lugones critique modernity and its affinity for firstness itself as Eurocentric, and reject the premise that history arches toward modernization as liberation. It follows that sexual liberation also can't follow that trajectory. So in the catalog essay I wrote, it goes backwards in history as a kind of confrontation of that. I won't do that here, but I'll share instead how the art history of sexuality in Mexico provides a crucial view onto the tensions and contradictions implicit in modernity and modernist discourses when seen from the South. It's in the context of those mixed feelings about firstness that I'd share a little bit about the etymology of homosexual in Spanish. To the earlier conversation, I have a PhD in comparative literature and teach in an art history department now, and not English, but in Spanish. So I'm trying to cover my terrain here. Mexican linguist and philologist José Modern de Alba offers that his best estimate for the beginning of the use of the term homosexual in Spanish was in the first decades of the 20th century. In the famous Corde, the first documentations are found in the more or less technical text by Gregorio Marañón, published between 1919 and 1920. The Spanish poet Unamuno also uses it in 1927. The Diccionario Real Académica Española finds space for it in the edition of 1936, assigning it the meaning sodomite, which, this is still a quote from him, he writes, which does not seem bad if one considers that a sodomite for the Dictionary of Authorities from that 1739 is one who commits sodomy, and sodomy is defined in the following terms: copulation between persons of the same sex. There's an earlier entry in a dictionary called the Diccionario de Lengua Española, published in 1917, Here the word homosexual appears, and it was defined as, quote, that which has the same sex with relation to another. Que tiene el mismo sexo con relación a otro. Since that early definition did not reference same-sex desire or the relationships named in 1936, we can kind of presume that the word began to be used in that sense in the interlude between. That is, around the time that Rodriguez Lozano painted this portrait of Novo. A fascinating collections of photographs from around 1895. So this is, I'm going to go through a few stages of modernity. So this is called modern criminality. Of these photographs from inside the Lecumberri prison held by the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia reveals that Mexico was subject to European scientific discourses that criminalized non-heteronormative sexualities, particularly using photography, that modern technology par excellence, not just to document them, but to produce them as anti-modern. In a study of similar turn-of-the-century photographs of gender non-conforming men in the Belém prison in Mexico City, Ernesto Reséndez Oicon explains, quote, it's difficult to speak of a homosexual identity understood as a fixed, closed, discrete, coherent, and ahistorical category. Without historical evidence of the use of the word or the self-understanding of subjects as members of such a group, he concludes, it would be incorrect to project such an identity on the prisoners pictured. What or whom, then, do these images portray? There are a few hints to these. One, the nicknames of all the men are in the feminine in Spanish, La Choringa, La Gamusa. Two, unlike the others, these photographs, it's part of the larger album as you see on the left, these photographs do not name the crime for which they're imprisoned. So perhaps their delinquency is sexual in nature. And finally, we see this number, 41, on the page of the album. Most likely, another later amendment, not yet at a time when homosexual was in use in Mexico. So what is the 41? It's not the page of the album. The number 41 most likely refers to an event portrayed in a work in the exhibition, which displays the complexity of aesthetic production that embodies the tension between the criminalization and liberation of non-heteronormative citizens. This was the case of the 41 in November 1901. The renowned printmaker José Guadalupe Posada published a broadsheet with Antonio Vanegas Arroyo that memorialized an event that, like his thousands of other widely distributed prints, combined image and word, news and fantasy, desire and fear. The 41 maricones found in a dance on the Calle de la Paz, the 20th of November 1901, features the arrest of a group of men found partying in the historical center of Mexico City. Posada's print has become iconic of an event that Robert McKee Irwin describes as having, quote, sexual connotations of the kind that soon became known as homosexual. The news is told in verse, and Carlos Monsiváis, a leading voice for dissident sexualities in Mexico for the last half of the 20th century, describes the event as follows. The historical register of gays in Mexico begins in 1901, in the capital of the Republic with the Great Roundup of the 41. The police interrupt a dance where half of the attendees have cross-dressed. The detainees are sent to the headquarters, and there, those who do not pay for their freedom are sent to a forced labor camp in the Valle Nacional. According to legend, one, number 42, escapes the juridical record. Don Ignacio de la Torre, owner of the Hacienda of Morelos, married to Amada, the daughter of the dictator Porfirio Diaz. The engravings by Posada make the scandal famous, and the number 41 remains an emblem of hilarity at the expense of the unnatural. Now, we might note that neither the 1857 Constitution nor the 1871 Penal Code, the laws still in effect in 1901, actually criminalized sexual relations between people designated as of the same sex. The partygoers were arrested instead on the kind of moral offenses, the unnatural Monsiváis named, and journalist Heriberto Frias reported on at the time. The criminologist Carlos Rumagnac and others constituted as, quote, a serious deviation that should be controlled because otherwise it could infect broader sectors of society and put nothing less than the social and political structure of the nation at risk. The terminology of the Posada headline, the word maricones, translated loosely as fags, announces sexuality as the site of ongoing struggles and the simultaneous expansion of popular culture into the exclusive realm of fine arts and letters. What and how that maricon signified has been the source of energetic debates in the distinct fields of Mexican and Latinx sexuality studies. José Ricardo Chavez explains that previous to this highly publicized declaration about maricones, the word afeminado, effeminate, dominated 19th century Mexican literature. He writes, a man who has or would like to have sexual relations with another man does not exist, but there is his equivalent, the effeminate, a deviant form from the hegemonic masculine norm that competes in flirtation and loquaciousness with women, although without having sex with another man. In this sense, the effeminate man is defined for his social comportment, gestures, taste in clothing, dance, and perfumes. Chavez argues that while the colonial term sodomy, sodomia, was deeply troubling, at least sex and eroticism were embedded in it. So we're seeing these debates in Mexico. In the world of letters, he explains afeminados were identified with clothing rather than sexual desire. However, he notes, the rich expressive language of popular culture offers terms like joto and puto, a serious vocabulary for the range of performative self-presentations that included cross-dressing, gestures, and poses. Think back to Novo and the Taxi Drivers. The debates about the Posada broadsheets focus extensively on how to read that performativity. Some researchers find opportunities for rescuing the erotic pleasures of the original event, especially in the headline describing the maricones as muy chulos y coquetones, very cute and flirty, and the image portraying mustachioed men, some in dresses and padded waists and buttocks, and some in suits, dancing quite happily with one another. Monsiváis emphasized the power of the Posada engravings as, quote, the beginning of a tradition, gestures, predilections, vocabulary, prisoner condition, or vocation. And Chicano studies scholar Robert Hernandez notes the impact of these images on a transnational Mexican community. He warns, Hernandez, that, quote, in these lithographs, maricones are obedient, frivolous, docile, and ultimately contained by a heteromasculinist authority and a machista disciplining gaze. He's much more suspect of resurrecting these images. But he instead calls to engage them through what he calls a mariconographic resistant reading strategy, which is a great word but hard to say, that recodes them and the denigrating violence of maricon. Historian Robert Franco traces decades of, quote, contestations by elite state and cultural actors and activists from the 1940s through the 1970s to remove the stigma and shame associated with the 41, and argues that they began a process of homosexual identity formation and liberation that eventually enabled the proliferation of new and radical modes of representation and community dialogue by the end of the century. Note, though, that we only reach this flurry of historical corrections and debates and possibilities, political possibilities, through the word maricono, not homosexual. We can see some of the pleasure and performance in this later series of portraits of imprisoned Mexicans. Here named homosexual, again, after the fact, and more likely better recognized in that complex tradition of maricon. Another way to think about this issue is to ask, when and why did the word homosexual get attached to these images if it was not in circulation at the time they were taken? So being a scholar, I called the archive and asked them if they had a record, when did it get attached? And they don't know. There is no record of when it appeared in the metadata of the photographs. But note that this information about the photographs that share the campy and performative pleasures of the descriptions of the 41 was shared by their prison guard. That's what it says in the as much as almost all of the 41 partiers were sent to a forced labor camp. So attaching the word homosexual to the images after the fact does not appear to have rescued them from their capture by modern criminality. So I'd like to take another look at the modern here in modern antiquities. Now, visual references to Greco-Roman antiquities pervade the global exhibition, sharing modern references to same-sex histories in the ancient Western tradition. When we look at this idea of antiquity in Mexico, we get a fascinating twist. Art historian Fausto Ramirez recognizes in the aesthetics of the 19th and early 20th century modernismo a kind of symbolism that we see in Saturnino Herran's painting Nuestros Dioses Antiguos, Our Ancient Gods. Herran's canvas and photographs by Luis Marquez that are also in the exhibition but separated in the space, so look for them together when you're there, combine the dreamlike quality of symbolist poetry and the neoclassicism of fantasies about ancient civilizations. Ramirez associates this ornate and delicate aesthetic with the manner that Mexican nationalist modernism, they are, after all, our gods, right, claimed Nahua and Maya civilizations, represented by darkened nudes rather than Greek and Roman statuary. Bedecked in gold, these exquisite figures paradoxically serve a nationalist function. Paradoxically because, of course, the Mexican nation was never at the service of the actual indigenous and Afro-descent people that are pictured in this antiquities fantasy. Deborah Dorotinsky and Laura Gonzalez argue that the androgyny of Marquez's subjects in a cache of previously unknown nudes by this major figure in Mexican photography destabilizes and evokes desire in the viewer, while the detailed realism of the medium photography breaks the flattened surfaces associated with painterly modernism. Rather than reassuring a presumed heterosexual viewer of the otherness of the bodies pictured then, the photographs address both a gay viewer and the repressive society that encircled it. That is to say, while somewhat veiled, the erotic charge of these images could not entirely be muted. Marquez's photographs draw the central poses of the prisoners in Belém out of the prison and places their expressions of Mexican modernist beauty, like Herran's Dioses, Our Ancient Gods, on par with the classic formalism of ancient Greece. If we look at another of Herran's paintings from the same period, of a woman from Tehuantepec, a community of indigenous people that fascinated modernist painters from the capitalist city, alongside photographer Graciela Iturride's late 20th century portrait of a Mushe from Cuchitan on the same narrow isthmus that connects the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, we can appreciate a century of Mexican art that tells another story of homosexuality, modernity and nation, and all of the attributed tensions. Modernists like Herran, Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo were fascinated by the Tehuanas, on the left, in part because of their apparently matriarchal society and largely because of their elaborate textiles. The faint mustache and the strong jawline of the sitter, in addition to the economic power associated with the Tehuanas, destabilize the gender binaries that Maria Lugones argues colonization brought to the Americas, along with race and racism. Indeed, the Mushe portrayed by Iturride are not homosexual or transvestite or queer, despite a flurry of recent fascination with them from the north. In one wonderful quote I read, the Mushe define themselves as, quote, ni hombre ni mujer, sino todo lo contrario, which means literally not man or woman, but everything to the contrary. It's crucial to note that Iturride and Herran were not from the Isthmus, not members of these indigenous communities, and in many ways foreign to them as they were to the Eurocentric Greco-Roman imaginaries that our gods replace. As much as Herran substitutes those Greco-Roman gods with Mexican fantasies about antiquity, his and Iturride's work projected modern national desires, sometimes queer, sometimes otherwise, onto indigenous bodies. So if this kind of projection seems unthinkable in the context of U.S. national imaginaries, let's take a look to close today at Ramon Novarro. I decided we should have a little fun tonight as well. The stage name for an actor, the Mediateca, the media holdings of the National Library of Mexico, describes as uno de los grandes Latin lovers del cine mudo, one of the great Latin lovers of the silent cinema. Novarro was born José Ramón Gil Samaniegos in Durango, Mexico in 1899 and grew up in a comfortable family led by his dentist father. In 1914, displaced by the Mexican Revolution, the family moved to that other great Mexican city, Los Angeles. In his films, Novarro played everything from an indigenous Aztec an Arab to Ben-Hur. His publicist, Herman Howe, wrote in the October 1925 issues of Motion Picture Classic, quote, "Long before I knew Ramon well, I was struck by the fact that the soul of the boy was not Spanish or Mexican, but Aztec. Born into that prolonged romance which is old Mexico blended out of Spanish and Aztec traditions with Oriental antecedents." Chicano studies scholar Ernesto Chavez explains that Navarro's bodily beauty emerged as an object of desire in ways that allowed him to transcend his racial self, and with it overcome the deeply racist impulses of Hollywood. Yet if we look at that projected vision, that reading of Navarro, alongside fellow gay Mexican artist Angel Sarraga's rendering of Navarro's beauty, those racializing projections sort of, it's a moving mirror. They appear, they disappear, even as much as they were definitely part of the portraits of sexuality of Tijuana and Muxé's subjects. So what is to be made of these performances of modern sexuality? Of homosexuality cast as modern and anti-modern, of maricones cast as homosexuals, and of racialized desire cast inside and outside communities. I'll close with this portrait of Guadalajara artist and antiquities dealer, Jesus Chucho Reyes Ferrero, painted by yet another gay artist of the group, Roberto Montenegro, just 2 years after Rodriguez Lozano painted Novo, as it puts another turn on sexuality and the performance of modern antiquities in Mexico. Art historian Karen Cordero Ryman calls Chucho a creative personality, which is true. She draws on feminist methodologies to reveal his contributions to serious aesthetic appreciation of domestic design, personal style, and objects that define designations as fine or popular art. We can understand Montenegro's complex presentation of Reyes seated amidst a multitude of objects that fill the collector and antiquity dealer's home. So there's a lot going on in this image. Sitting with a cameo in his hand, a golden religious statuette with colonial references, and transparent empty bottle fill the foreground of the painting, antique books and pottery the background, alongside arched doorways and a black and white patterned floor. Montenegro signals the broader reformulation of art that Reyes embodied by including his own distorted image here, reflected in an orb in the foreground of the portrait, in addition to heterogeneous combinations of popular and fine colonial and pre-Columbian works that augmented a collection inherited from his father. Reyes also contracted local artisans to produce new works inspired by those pre-Columbian works. One of these young artisans recalled his early childhood commissions from the collector to produce effectively forged pre-Columbian vessels made by the local heirs of those cultures, languages, and traditions. So we have here in this wonderful portrayal a kind of a funhouse effect of arched doorways, windows, and jagged walls, simultaneously exhilarating and again carceral, as Chucho dryly engages the spectator with a baleful look. The small self-portrait of Montenegro visible in the globe simultaneously embeds the relationship between artist and sitter in the picture plane, establishing both as potentially members of what was called el ambiente, that lively group of gay artists and writers that Novo and Rodriguez Lozano and Montenegro and all of the characters you've just met were also part of. But it also registers that carceral sphere. If the Mexican artists, photographers, writers, and prisoners featured here were not the first homosexuals, I hope the works we've seen may help to invert that narrative structure of modernity that made that impossible for so long. Thank you.
So next, it's my pleasure to introduce Eduardo Carrera, a curator, art historian, and cultural manager based in Philadelphia. He specializes in decolonial and queer approaches to art practices, history, and writing. Eduardo served as the director and curator of the Centro de Arte Contemporáneo de Quito in Ecuador, where he curated the annual exhibition program from 2017 to 2022. Eduardo is currently a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2024, he was awarded a research fellowship from Independent Curators International and the Marian Goodman Gallery. Please welcome to the podium Eduardo Carrera.
Hola, buenas noches. Quería saludar en español porque la exposición de First Homosexuals tiene una gran selección de artistas latinoamericanos, Brasil, México, Colombia, Perú, y creo que es importante a la comunidad latinoamericana de Chicago que está aquí decirles que vayan a visitarla. Said that, I'm going to translate myself to English. Okay. Art, gender, and colonial legacies, queer histories, and temporalities in Abya Yala. The engraving by Belgian illustrator Theodore de Vries, Balboa's Massacre of the Cueva, depicts a chaotic and violent scene set in a natural environment, a landscape lush with flora and fauna. In the foreground, Spanish soldiers with helmets and armor, wielding swords, spears, and flags, observe as a group of dogs brutally attacks a group of indigenous people, who appear scantily clad or naked. The soldiers' clothing and armor, in contrast to the victims' nudity, functions as a way to distinguish civilized subjects who wear clothing from savage subjects. The print depicts indigenous people undergoing torture. Their faces and body language express terror and desperation. Additionally, one can see the heads and pieces of flesh that the dogs have already turned off. In the background, behind the soldiers, mountains of some construction can be seen, suggesting it is set in maybe a comarca, a land region governed by the Cura, Bugle, and Vera or Wunepan peoples. The composition is densely populated with human figures, organized into two distinct categories: the colonizers, situated in the upper band, and the indigenous people, depicted below them. This hierarchical arrangement conveys a moral charge, highlighting the intensity and brutality of the massacre. The Vries' meticulous engraving style, characterized by fine lines and intricate details, accurately captures the textures and shine of the armor, clothing, and weapons of the soldiers, the fur and the teeth of the dogs, the flesh of the indigenous people, and the landscape, all enhancing the exotic, dramatic, and emotional impact of the scene. As part of the illustration, there is an epigraph in Latin that reads, Balboa advances towards the mountain of Darien with prophecies about Regulus and Carequa. There he falls alongside many indigenous people. The community, outraged by the death of Regulus and his brother, as well as other armed men, is deeply moved. The reason becomes evident. They understand that the cause of corruption lies in Regulus and all the courtiers, tainted by the nefando sin, of their nature. Therefore, Arturo Balboa detests this vile crime against the nobles so much that he gathers about 40 men and delivers them to the dogs to be torn apart. This essay examines representations of sodomy, cross-dressing, and homosexuality in Abya Yala, focusing on the Andean region, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and also Venezuela, across three historical periods: the colonial era, 15th to 18th centuries, the transition to an establishment of republics, 18th and 19th centuries, and the transition to the early modern period, late 19th, early 20th centuries. It highlights how these representations were shaped by colonial and racial power structures, as well as shifting social norms. As Maria Lugones argues, gender itself is a colonial introduction, a violent introduction consistently and contemporarily used to destroy people's cosmologies. Communities as the building ground of civilized West. This presentation explores how artistic works reflect and contest colonial systems of domination. By foregrounding these works with South American cultural history, it traces the complex intersections of queerness, deviance, and resistance from the 15th to the 20th century. Part 1. The Lands of Sinners and Sodomites. Diego Falconi, in his book From Ashes to Text, the Andean Literatures of Sexual Dissidence, in 20th century, delves into the complex web of sexual identity in Andean literature, focusing mainly on the legacy of colonial perceptions of sodomy. Falconi highlights how the term sodomite, originating from Europe and perpetuated by the Inquisition, reduced individuals to the presumed sin or crime, erasing their identities in the process. It's noteworthy that indigenous populations in the Americas maintain their own lexicon for naming non-binary or queer individuals. Cariwarmi in Quechua, Irinini in Aymara, and Huelle in Mapandun. These bodily identities, argues Falconi, exceed European understanding, resulting in simplistic and secondary characterizations of sodomites in colonial narratives. Falconi traces the ethnocentric contours of the sodomite across the Andes, revealing how narratives of sodomy serve to reinforce colonial power dynamics, particularly through of masculine violence exercised by figures such as the king, priest, and the conquistadores. In 1629, Hernando de la Cruz, a spiritual guide of Mariana de Jesus, painted the large format canvas El Infierno, Hell, for the Jesuit church in Quito. This canvas, characteristic of Andean Baroque art, was the largest in the church and strategically placed at the temple's main entrance. Although the original canvas has since disappeared, the church houses a reproduction that was executed in the second half of the 19th century by the Quito painter Alejandro Salas. The painting, characterized by a dominant use of red, depicts various scenes illustrating different scenes. Animals such as snakes, dragons, monkeys, and scorpions, along with lava, fire, and figures with horns, tails, actively torment sinners. Multiple vignettes show figures consumed by flames, condemned for their lust and carnal passions. Another section portrays a wheel with various bodies bound to it. The painting features 11 epigraphs enumerating various sins, such as murder, witchcraft, betrayal, theft, and lust. These words help identify and locate the scenes represented, guiding the viewer in interpreting the image. In one of the epigraphs, the word nefando appears, referring to sodomy. In this part of the painting, a fairy cave encloses a group of sacrilegious individuals. Among them, a woman in a nun's habit covers her head while a man seductively speaks directly into her ear. This image refers to practices considered sinful solicitations, that is, acts that transgress established moral or spiritual norms. The 16th century painting offers a vivid, chilling vision of the Last Judgment and the consequence of human sins. It reminds viewers of the importance of redemption and virtue in elderly life, while shockingly portraying the consequence of sinful acts such as promiscuity and sodomy. Representation of this kind foster a conservative imaginary related to sexual practices, religion, sin, and guilt in the Andes. Similarly, upon the arrival of the Spaniards and Portuguese to Abya Yala in the 15th century, racial categories were instituted to classify individuals based on their ethnic origins. European colonizers introduced a caste system that hierarchized people based on their racial purity. The main groups were peninsulares, Spaniards born of the Iberian Peninsula, criollos, the descendants of Spaniards born in America, indígenas, the native inhabitants of America, and Afrodescendientes, individuals brought from Africa as enslaved people. In the 16th century, a more complex caste system developed that included terms such as mestizo, Spanish and indigenous mix, mulatto, Spanish and African mix, sambo, indigenous and African mix, and others reflecting the diverse combination of racial mixing. This caste system, introduced by European colonizers, not only delineated a stratified social structure in Americas, but also left a lasting legacy that still influences racial, social, and economic dynamics in the region today. Further, the caste system had a significant impact on Latin American society, leading to the emergence of expressions such as mejorar la raza, or bettering the race, historically referring to the eugenistic concept of enhancing human genetics through selective breeding, with racist implications especially notable in the early 20th century. Over time, interracial relationships between European indigenous peoples and Africans became more common, especially in urban and border areas, leading to the emergence of a significant mestizo population. Governments institutionalized racial categories and mestizo identities through census, parish registers, and other forms of documentation. Although colonial elites attempt to maintain racial separation, the barriers were permeable in practice. Mestizaje was not only racial, but also cultural, resulting in fusion of indigenous European African traditions, which gave rise to new cultural forms encompassing everything from food and music to religious beliefs, spiritual practices, and social customs. Part 2, Mestizaje and Cross-Dressing. Mestizaje and racial categories contributed to a complex social stratification in colonial America, where racial policies and attitudes determine access to resources, power, and rights. This process of mestizaje gave rise to syncretic cultures in which European, indigenous, and African elements merged to shape the contemporary cultures of Latin America. According to Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, mestizaje does not simply imply fusion or hybridization, but rather the readjustment and redefinition of identities. It involves not only the coexistence of cultural and ethnic elements, but also the emergence of a new identity, the cheje, resulting from the mixtures and conflict. In the post-colonial period, many nationalist movements championed mestizaje as the foundation of national identity, celebrating mixture and diversity as essential characteristics of Latin America. In addition to nationalist fervor, this period witnessed a push toward democracy and increased political participation. Criollo elites and intellectuals began to question and challenge existing colonial power structures, promoting self-government and popular sovereignty ideals. These ideals were reflected in independence movements and the struggle for political self-determination, eventually leading to the emancipation of several Latin American countries. Throughout the 19th century, in this context, visual arts, literature, music, and other cultural expressions shaped national identity. Artworks captured political and social changes, revitalizing interest in cultural roots and indigenous tradition and reaffirming each country's unique identity. The arts further challenged established social and cultural norms by questioning power structures and imposed standards, particularly with colonial and religious art. This challenge led to new forms of expressions, such as landscapes, portraiture, and costumbrismo, an artistic style that depicted everyday life customs and social practices, particularly in Latin America. Francisco Fierro watercolor painting Hombres Vestidos de Mujer is an example of Peruvian costumbrista art from the 19th century. This genre offers a glimpse into the cultural and social dynamics of the time. Hombres Vestidos de Mujer stands out as an exploration of gender roles and performativity in the context of Lima during the 19th century. In this watercolor, Fierro captures as a scene where men are dressed in feminine attire, possibly reflecting cultural practices such as carnival celebrations, theatrical performance, or the ending New Year festivities, or other social events in which cross-dressing was common. The meticulous representation of clothing and the figure's expression indicate a detailed observation of these cultural practices, which serve as cultural entertainment. Maria Lugones argues that mestizaje is a strategy implying the ability to move between categories and systems of cultural significance, without being completely trapped by any of them. Historically, Fierro's work can be interpreted as part of the broader Latin American artistic traditions that confronts the legacies of colonialism, the hybridization of cultures, and the complexities of identity, questioning the caste and gender system established during the colonial period. In Fierro's watercolor, mestizaje and cross-dressing embody intricate cultural phenomena that have contested and reshaped norms of gender and identity across various cultures in Peru and the Andes. As a process of cultural and racial syncretism, mestizaje has engendered hybrid identities that transcend established ethnic and cultural boundaries. Conversely, cross-dressing through deliberate and performative expressions of gender divergent from those assigned at birth disrupts gender norms and subverts social expectations. Both phenomena often disrupt gender norms and subvert social expectations. Both phenomena offer insights into the complexity and fluidity of identities in Latin America, illustrating how social and cultural categories can be reinterpreted and transformed to cultural practices. Those are other Francisco Fierro's watercolors. And then, in another anonymous costumbrista watercolor from the 19th century, Hombres pasándose aguardiente de boca a boca, men passing aguardiente from mouth to mouth, a practice from the Yumba culture, is illustrated. In this scene, two men share aguardiente, a type of liquor, by transferring it from person to person as a part of a ritual mouth cleansing. Their touching lips suggest a kiss, while the position and intertwining of their arms suggest a hug. They are also looking directly into each other's eyes. This image offers a notable impression for visitors to the National Museum of Ecuador, seeing a gesture of affection and care between two people of the same sex. But this interpretation of the image underscores how Western epistemological categories were imposed upon local cultures. The image questions and then denaturalizes the Western sexual order. It offers a portrayal of indigenous subjects in contrast to the representation of white homosexuals that have defined a Europeanized conception of the homosexual body in global art history since the 19th century. Ecuador's queer community appropriated and reinterpreted this imagery, integrating it into the struggles of indigenous queer communities in the global south. In the 19th century, individuals previously categorized as sodomites began to be recognized as understood with the emerging category of homosexuals. Unlike sodomite, which focused more on the sexual act itself, homosexual encompassed a broader identity and sexual orientation. In this context, addressing the representation of homosexuality in Latin American art requires an approach that recognizes the social and cultural complexities of the region. Rudy Blaze, in Imágenes de Ambiente, Homosexuality and Latin American Art Today, points out that studying gay art in Latin America is an even more significant challenge than in other contexts, given the diversity of historical, political, and social influences converging in this geographic area. Nellie Richard comments on the risk of disinsertion and fetishization, concepts that also apply to the definition and placement of homosexuality tropes in Latin American art. Disinsertion, or the decontextualized transplantation of Eurocentric categories and concepts from Anglo-European vocabulary of sexual roles and identities to Latin America, will violate the ongoing representation of the continent's cultures, practices, and partially overlapping sexual identities. Similarly, fetishization will imply the inappropriate adoptions of these Anglo-European categories at the expenses of a proper understanding of the individual's artist's creative universe. Blaze and Richards emphasize how complex it is to integrate homosexuality into Latin American art, warning about the risk of decontextualizing and fetishizing Eurocentric concepts in such a culturally diverse context as Latin America. Walter Mignolo's concept of colonial difference underscores the intersection where global designs and local histories collide, generating spaces for the emergence of subaltern knowledge and border thinking. He describes the colonial difference as the space where the coloniality of power enact, and where local histories must navigate, adapt, or resist global designs. This framework illuminates how queerness in post-colonial contexts emerges by confronting distinct historical trajectories shaped by coloniality. Similarly, Homi Bhabha notions of third space captures the hybrid identities that arise within these intersections. These spaces, marked by cultural negotiations and transformations, produce new meanings and subjectivities that challenge traditional binaries. For queer subjects, these hybrid spaces often amplify their marginality, placing them in liminal positions that transcend both original and transcultural contexts, creating what Bhabha terms in-between identities. Together, Mignolo and Bhabha reveal how colonial power dynamics not only marginalize, but also generate new epistemologies and identity in post-colonial queer experiences. A dissident and transvestite modernity. In Latin America, colonization heavily influenced the process of modernity, followed by the independence from European powers. The legacies of colonialism led to a complex interaction between economic modernization based on the export of raw materials, social changes such as the formation of Creole elite, and the development of policies often marked by structural inequalities and economic dependency. Modern identities and subjectivities in Europe and the United States developed with the environment of rapid industrialization and intellectual and cultural movements that redefined modernity in those regions. In contrast, in Latin American modernity was shaped by hybridization of social and intellectual movements, indigenous communities, ancestral cultures, and Creole elites. In this context, the emergence of the modern homosexual subject in the late 19th century and early 20th century varied significantly across Europe, the US, and Latin America, due to diverse cultural, social, legal, and political influence. While European American homosexual subcultures gained visibility, Latin Americans, shaped by conservative Catholic morality, imposed widespread criminalization and stigmatization, forcing homosexual communities to operate clandestinely and remain difficult to identify. These subcultures develop intricate codes and covert networks to navigate the oppressive environment, creating a complex social fabric that allows for the expressions of homosexual despite the pervasive risk. Since the emergence of the term homoerotism in the 19th century, it has most frequently depicted representations involving white subjects in European and American context, ignoring or making invisible relationships between people of different races or ethnicities. When approaching an homoerotic interpretation of the art of Carlos Bacaflor, works such as Abel Muerto, An Estudio de Joven, suggest emotional intimacy, sensual bonds, or an idealization of male beauty. In Abel Muerto, Bacaflor portrays a young white man recycling naked on the steps. His face and head lie on the ground, eyes closed. His skin contrasts with the tones of the underlying ground, accentuating his slender feminine waist and elongated figure. The subject pose evokes a vulnerable, defeated, effeminate body, reminiscent of recurrent representations of figures like Jesus or Saint Sebastian in the history of Western art. By contrast, the subject in Estudio de Joven has a darker skin tone. In his work, the subject is reflected in a mirror within the painting. The mirror has often been used as a metaphor for the act of picturing or representing itself. Mirrors also frequently symbolize introspection, self-awareness, or the idea of reflecting illusion versus reality. Bacaflor and other painters of his time sometimes use mirrors to explore themes of identity, perceptions, and the relationship between the viewer and the subject. In this sense, the subject depicted carries real psychological weight. More than a simple anatomical study, it is a picture of deep subjectivity. The nude or semi-nude subject, one arm raised above the head, reflects the painting ability to capture not only the physical form, but the emotional and psychological complexity of the subject portrayed. Colonial modernity spurred the development of nascent national Creole mestizo society, solidifying the hegemony of Creoles, who both sought to mimic and yet set themselves apart from white Europeans. Bacaflor was part of this privileged group, self-identifying as Neo-European, while affirming their position within the nation. Living between Lima and Paris, Bacaflor artistic creation inhabited a third space, a hybrid in-between realm where the classical European painting norms of the period were transformed through the inclusion of Peruvian models and cultural references. This cosmopolitan space allowed for the emergence of hybrid cultural meanings and identities that transcend traditional boundaries. By the early 20th century, the arts have evolved into a platform for the expression of queer individuals. The photographs of Benjamin de la Calle depict individuals engaging in cross-dressing and hint at homosexual relationships in Medellin at the beginning of the 20th century. In the portrait of Álvaro Echeverría, El Excluido, the outcast, Echeverría appears seated in a cocktail dress adorned with a feather headpiece, jewelry, and high-heel shoes. He wears gloves and a stocking covering his calves, posing with one hand in his face and looking directly at the camera with a subtle smile. This portrait presents an individual intentionally posing to be photographed, conscious of their attire in an intimate environment. De la Calle's work can be interpreted as a counterpoint to prevalent homophobic representations in contemporary media, especially newspapers that use comical or caricature representations. His portraits of cross-dressers expand conceptions of queer subjectivities in the early 20th century. In Abismos Temporales, Feminismo, Estéticas Travestis y Teoría Queer, Nellie Richards conducts an analysis of travestismo, or cross-dressing, in Latin American art as a symbol of contracultural rebellion against patriarchal hegemony and the simulacrum of democratic transition, anticipating the transformation of the male-male code into an internationalized gay identity. Richards suggests that the disappearance of La Loca, literally the crazy woman, as a scene in the Echevarria portrait, as an outdated representation of this new social order. These are other pictures of Benjamin de la Calle. In Venezuela, Alfredo Bulton's photographs of friends and colleagues in the artistic and cultural sphere mark his pride in his country, while simultaneously chronicling the travels and adventures made possible by his privileged social status. In the 1930s, he began a series of portraits that included prominent figures from Venezuela local art scene, including models Luis León and Ramon, who also posed for fellows Venezuelan Francisco Narváez. Bulton photographs El Sueño del Rey Miguel, The Dream of King Miguel, depicts a black man holding a veil with closed eyes. This gesture suggests a connection between the act of closing one's eyes and listening to the veil, as if sound and dream are intertwined and captured in the photograph. The portrait of Miguel, a young Venezuelan with a smooth dark skin, represents racialized subjects from the Americas as individuals endowed with agency, subjectivity, and erotism. Bulton's photographs not only capture the essence of Venezuelan mestizo beauty, an idea he developed to celebrate what he termed the exuberant beauty of our race, arising from the nation's diverse racial heritage of white, indigenous, and black ancestry, but also delve into the homoerotic portraits featuring black, mestizo, and Creole Latin American subjects. In contrast, the film Límite, directed by Brazilian director Mario Peixoto, is set in the disconcerting scenario of a rural cemetery in Brazil, surrounded by trees, palms, and mountains. In it, one of the characters, Man Juan, encounters another, played by Peixoto. The meeting brings with homoerotism. Peixoto plays with a wedding ring and holds Man Juan's jacket with emotion. They share the experience of lighting a cigar that initially appears real but turns out to be a piece of wood. The intensity of the gazes between both men is notable. This scene leads into a sequence of chaotic images in which Man Juan frenetically searches for Peixoto, and the homoerotic nonsense of the encounter manifests in an image of Man Juan as a prisoner of his conformity to social heteronormativity. Límite, radical critique of heteronormativity, marriage, and capitalism, is supported by an equality-bold treatment of space and time based on a sequence of images that challenges linear temporality. This resistance to linear temporality underscores how the film questions social norms and opens as a space to imagine alternative possibilities of existence and human relationships. From the colonial era to the early 20th century, this presentation has explored diverse representations such as sodomy, travestism, cross-dressing, homoerotism, and homosexuality in Avia Yala, the Andes, and South America. Each period and artwork analyzed has illuminated how perceptions of queerness were molded by colonial dynamics of oppression and resistance. With equal measure, evidence of queer experiences have shaped and reshaped the continent. Thank you.
So, gracias, Eduardo. It's now my pleasure to introduce Joseph Shaikewitz, a writer and PhD candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. Their research is focused on histories of modern art, performance, and visual studies, in addition to feminist, queer, and trans theory. Beginning in the fall, they will be a curatorial fellow in the Department of Latin American Art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. I had the pleasure of learning more about Joseph's work this fall and can attest that everyone here is in for a treat. So please join me in welcoming Joseph Shaikewitz.
Okay, hi everyone. Last one. Thank you for bearing with us. I wanted to first thank Jonathan and Johnny, who is somewhere, for the invitation to be part of this weekend's convening. It's been a privilege and, dare I say, fun, working with you both even in the smallest way on the first Homosexuals, and I'm happy we can celebrate the ideas and space you've cultivated through this project. I'm also grateful to Esther and Eduardo, whose work I deeply admire, for sharing these presentations and for the chance to be in conversation. And finally, I want to thank Chirag and Melissa so much, and the teams at Wrightwood 659 and here at the Alliance Française for their work realizing this important exhibition and symposium. This evening, I'll be presenting Invertidos, Afeminados, and the Trouble of Making Visible, Queer Transvisual Culture in Brazil and the Southern Cone. The title draws on two Portuguese and Spanish cognates, invertidos, or inverts, and afeminados, or effeminate ones, femmes, as Esther has so helpfully laid out for us already, which speak both to our geographic focus, Brazil, and an area known as the Southern Cone, the countries in the southernmost region of South America, and to the terms that circulated around what we might today call queer and trans life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, I wanted to begin not with an artwork, but with a person, Ginalma de Paradela, a Brazilian socialite living in Europe around the turn of the 20th century. We encounter her here in the German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld's important 1910 book, Transvestites. Hirschfeld coined this term in an attempt to differentiate the queer genders of those like de Paradela from the language of homosexuality and sexual inversion that had come to contain them, cleaving open, however provisionally, diagnostic language of the period that collapsed gender presentation and sexual identity. The author and subject would have met in Berlin, where de Paradela lived for some time after leaving Rio de Janeiro. But as a text like this forces us to acknowledge, with its caption stating that her story, quote, ended in suicide in December 1906, it was only in the afterlife that she found notoriety and fame. The tale of her death circulated far and wide, including back to her native Brazil, as we see here in an article published in the satirical magazine O Malho. It becomes well-nigh impossible to make out the truth of de Paradela across the forensic and press sources in which she appears. However, these different traces do revolve around a similar story. After becoming engaged to a language professor, she and her fiancé moved to Breslau, Poland. But for some ever-elusive reason, de Paradela began to undergo a spell of illness. Though she refused medical care at first, a physician eventually came to examine her in her home, and the expose in O Malho recounts the ensuing incident as follows, quote, unable to escape the doctor's insistence, she retreated to a nearby powder room, where she said she would ready herself for the exam. Yet, within moments, the violent poison she ingested began to produce its effects, killing her in an instant. This inexplicable suicide, the author regales its readers, was not what most surprised the people and authorities called to observe the case, but rather the circumstance verified that this was not a woman, but a man. Yeah, wow. This sensationalized account understands de Paradela's death, this fatal evasion of a medicalized existence, as an event that brings us closer to some kind of truth about who she was in life. Like many gender-variant people made visible in the early 20th century, her transfemininity is figured through an idiom of disposability, deviance, duplicity, and deceit. Further still, the magazine construes her gender as perilously unbound to the places in which she lived. As the journalist spins a tale by which, quote, here in Rio, in Montevideo, in Buenos Aires, she was always and only an unruly, effeminate type, end quote. Despite the absence of evidence suggesting her travels to Uruguay or Argentina, de Paradela is imagined as if transgressing national borders and pervading this part of South America. This has the effect of making her body, and by extension her transness, something like an airborne toxin, uncontainable and just as noxious as the substance with which she took her own life. Staying true to its lurid tone, the article ends by warning readers about the dangers of this, quote, fatally inverted person and of those like her. The terminology of inversion invoked here held a prominent place in the criminological, medical, and popular discourse surrounding queer desires and embodiments in the early 20th century. It refracted ideas of sexual and gender dissidence that emerged in the European sexological sciences of the late 19th century and became a linguistic catch-all of sorts, a mutable and capacious descriptor for those whose attractions, behaviors, and self-knowings deviated from the fixed rubric of gender binarism and sexual morality. In the context of Latin America, inversion too became an incessantly criminalized and pathologized category, one that, as we'll see, doubled as a container for anxieties around race, immigration, vice, and the efficacies of the governable nation-state. Now, what I hope to call attention to in today's talk is specifically the role that images played in shoring up these ideas of queer and trans delinquency, and in creating a logic by which these inverted longings could be pictorialized and therefore detected, contained, controlled, in some instances even eradicated. While it can be very tempting to look at visual traces of queer and trans life as moments for celebration and kinship with the past, we must also take into account how being, or being made visible in the early 20th century, abutted these state desires to externalize, typologize, and discipline gender and sexual difference. And so I begin here with the regimes of vision, those logics of looking, recognition, and representation that shaped the worlds of queer and trans people as an essential prelude to the history of art we'll examine together in the final section of my talk. So let's take this representation of Gabara as one salient example. The magazine's editors illustrated the article with two images of their subject. The first, a photograph of what we're told is her, wearing masculine wardrobe and a mustache, and the second, a drawing, in which she appears in a flowing gown, one gloved hand holding a small fan, the other perched on the edge of a table. What's meant to go unspoken within this pairing is the ways it structures an argument through its use of these two different types of media. The image on the left makes recourse to ideas of photographic and sexual truth. That is, it takes up the medium of photography, something that we're told faithfully and credibly captures the real, as the ideal vehicle for arriving at some ostensible truth of Gabara's gender. In contrast, a cartoonist's hand-drawn illustration of Gabara, as seen on the right, siphons her femininity through the rhetoric of a pictorial invention, of fabrication, of falsehood. The artist's situation of this scene amidst something like a stage set further equates her womanhood with fantasy, artifice, and simulation. By foregoing the known photographic imagery of Gabara in favor of this image, the piece subtly dramatizes the idea that her transness exists in a world distinct from photography's affectation of the real. The camera proved an especially able tool in perpetuating these ideas of visual and sexual truth, and in carrying out gender and sexuality's normative regimes, as revealed in this early article from Argentina, published in the specialized journal Archives of Psychiatry and Criminology, or Archivos. The subject of this case history, one of several who appeared in its pages, is a Paraguayan-born hairdresser by the name of Aurora. She was arrested for attending an invert ball at a Buenos Aires brothel in 1903 and taken to a local psychiatric clinic. It's there that she was seen by Dr. Francisco de Vega, the criminologist who penned this write-up. Throughout the piece, de Vega appeals to the reader that the illusion of Aurora's gender can be detected by comparing her look in one professional photograph of her in a fashionable dress and updo with another, a tightly cropped portrait shot at the clinic over the course of her stay. The production of this second, and I would say hard to look at, image speaks to the close entanglements of clinical and pictorial capture. It also serves to send a message, affirming the ability of De Vega and the clinic in which he worked to turn out normatively gendered and desiring subjects. The layout of these two photographs is also striking. Through this graphic strategy suggesting a before and an after, the juxtaposition posits transfemininity as a terminable, discardable perception of oneself, thus staging a social death across a single spread of the issue. De Vega's writing sees virtue in this forced process of detransition, as he boasts how, quote, upon leaving the clinic after having suffered the disciplinary regime that governs there for several days, her faggy air seemed to have dissipated considerably, end quote. But it's the production of this second photograph and its layout in the page that allows De Vega to corroborate this claim, although I think we're all well familiar with how feeble an idea of this dissipated faggy air truly is. Now, whereas Archivos catered to an erudite audience, images of trans life too circulated in the popular press of the early 20th century. Take, for example, this article that appeared in an Argentine satirical magazine in 1902. Titled, "The Man-Woman Discovered in Viedma," it tells of an anonymous tradesperson who was arrested in a northeastern province of the country for disobeying an enrollment law that required indigenous subjects like her to register with the state. According to the expose, it's only as a result of this infraction and her subsequent detention in a local penitentiary that her transness was recognized by a physician working for the province. The photographic sequence beneath the text retrospectively stages this discovery, tracing trans embodiment from a hidden duplicity to its moments of detection and reveal. It lays out the event through a legible and easy-to-follow succession whose climactic turning point comes in the form of the besuited doctor. As a compositional and narrative fulcrum, his body encroaches on and interrupts the world of the individual before him, creating a visual separation between her and the errant femininity in the preceding frame. However, in this tidy reenactment, it's not through any specialized tools that he detects her gendered deviance. Rather, he's shown to achieve this through sight and suspicion alone. In turn, the series offers up a didactic exercise, luring readers into this same search and ridicule of queer embodiments in their daily lives. And the fact that the photographer has staged this scene on the street rather than in the jail cell where this encounter originally took place reinforces this idea that you, the reader, too might be so assiduous in your daily life. What's more, the framing of these images echoes ethnographic photographs of indigenous types produced after what's known as the conquest of the desert, a concerted period of indigenous dispossession and genocide carried out by the Argentine government in the last quarter of the 19th century. In this way, the article traffics in the racialization of gender difference and its enmeshments with coloniality, exploiting the camera with the aim of restricting forms of indigenous sovereignty and trans embodiment that exceed the normative confines of national citizenship. Returning for a moment to the journal Archivos, where we first encountered Aurora, allows us to parse the very means by which stories of trans life were manipulated and made to carry these political fantasies of the end of trans. This can be seen through the case of La Bicha Otero, a Spanish emigre and sex worker in Buenos Aires who debuted in one of the many treatises published by De Vega. What's most remarkable about her appearance in Archivos is the case's suggestion that she contributed her own autobiography to De Vega's clinical figuration of her. Her text begins, "I was born in Madrid in 1880. I have always believed myself to be a woman, and for that reason I wear women's clothing. I was married in Seville and had 2 children." And I'll continue on to the next paragraph. "My husband has died and I am a widow. Sometimes I want to die when I remember him. I would search for phosphorus or coal to kill myself, but those suicides seem pedestrian to me. Since I enjoy flowers, I think it would be delicious to die suffocated by perfumes." I'm going to ask us to just put a pin in this deathly longing, which we'll return to again in a minute. From descriptions of childbirth and her desire to enter into a convent, to her sought-after talents with manual and oral sex, her writing teeters between biographical fragments and rousing, if not apocryphal, tidbits. This surfaces especially in a salacious poem that makes up part of her personal testimony, and in which she plays freely with the genre of the case history. From Buen Retiro to Alameda, those with crazy tastes come to me to be satisfied. My boys, hold it stiff, and with my hand I will give you pleasure. We really lose some of the frisson of this text with the translation, but I hope those who can read in Spanish and later in Portuguese can grasp some of their delight. Her lecherous autobiography is not all, it's a lot. I can send this around later. Her lecherous autobiography is not all that l'Abbé Otero entrusted to De Vega. She also handed over this set of 3 professional studio portraits that bring into the visual field her femme self-knowing. She makes reference to these in the closing of her testimony, affirming, quote, "This is my story, and I have the honor of gifting to Dr. Vega some portraits along with my dedication," end quote. The photographs themselves conform to a bourgeois tradition of late 19th and early 20th century portraiture, especially the small-scale exchangeable format of the French carte de visite, and show her wearing a modest gown and bonnet as she poses before a painted backdrop of a classicized interior. There is clearly so much to say about the figure of l'Abbé Otero. She played the role of criminological curiosity quite well. But in the interest of time, I want to call forward one unsettling twist that her story underwent only a few years later, when it reappeared in the book The Underworld in Buenos Aires by the Argentine jurist Eusebio Gomez. In a chapter on homosexuality and sexual inversion, Gomez opted to feature l'Abbé Otero, reprinting her reminiscences verbatim. And yet, we can notice how illustrating her testimony is a single portrait not seen before. It shows her in the same cinched dress and hat as the photographs in Archivos, but the cloth backdrop and studio props, most notably the floral arrangement beside her, differ. The question of where Gomez obtained this image goes unaddressed in his writing. Was it an outtake from the original 1903 study? Did l'Abbé Otero extend it to Gomez? Did the two ever even meet? What fascinates and also disturbs me about the apparition of this image is the way it gives visual form to l'Abbé Otero's romantically macabre prose that I read earlier, now situated just beside the text. Sometimes I want to die when I remember my late husband. Since I enjoy flowers, I think it would be delicious to die suffocated by perfumes. Her invocation of floral aromas as an allegory of death is here intensified by the image of her standing beside the bouquet, the promise of her olfactory demise lurking right there on the page. Whether deliberate or by chance, the curious materialization of this portrait and its placement next to the quoted passage dramatize the imposed proximity between transfemininity, perishing, and death, something that the figuration of G. Paradera's story in Brazil would too deem natural, irrefutable. So by now I hope we've tuned our eyes to just a small sampling of the ways that images served not as mere witnesses to the conditions of queer and trans life, but as insidious forces that were essential in producing them. If I've focused so far on a specifically trans femme history, it's to confirm not only what we know to be true already, of the ways the femmes among us have long existed at the vanguard of queer politics, with all the vulnerabilities it opens them to, but also to set up how even the early representation and derision of male homosexuality borrowed from these associations between effeminacy, immorality, social contagion, and vice. This is something we observe in an illustration that appeared in O Mario that lampoons the public presence of this fresca, or fresh one, a common epithet for effete gay men in Brazil. The satirist accentuates this figure's lissom silhouette, flamboyant curves, and foppish demeanor from his ruched hat down to his heeled shoes to make a mockery of Rio's effeminate city dwellers. He's pictured sauntering through Tiradentes Square, a popular cruising site since the late 19th century, identifiable by the equestrian statue of Brazil's founding emperor looming in the distance. Underneath, a poem alludes to the subject's vocation as a sex worker, newly down on his luck during the plaza's closure for renovation. It is a rather hard shock that constrains one's freedom in this ungrateful profession. And from the mayor of the city, I require compensation. Yes, you do. The caricature readily equates homosexuality with prostitution, decadence, and moral and political decay, but consolidates this through a visual idiom of effete masculinity, reflecting again the ways sexual difference was made legible through a vocabulary of transgressive genders. And it's these very associations that created a visual bind that artists in succeeding decades would contend with and find meaning within. So finally, paintings. We've arrived. Here we see how in two works by the Argentine painter Alfredo Butero, he emphasizes his sitter's dandified masculinities with these fabulous, graceful postures in ways that come close to, without rendering explicit, a homosexual identification. This tactic works in tandem with the well-appointed salons in which we find them. The interior's already feminized grammar of the decorative, further enciphering the painting's gay undertones. Understanding these contiguities, these adjacencies between queerness, effeteness, and polished urbanity allows us to push past a facile or definitive assertion that these subjects of Butero's paintings were, point blank, homosexual. It's of course a possibility that we need not rule out. But by proposing this mode of reading these paintings, we begin to interrupt and put pressure on the visual logics so prominent during this period that would want us to think we can know these sitters' sexualities through their external appearances alone. Carlos Alberto Castellanos, a painter of the same generation, took a more oblique approach to this figural idiom of a queer body. The artist very likely completed this work in Montevideo in his native Uruguay, as suggested by the slice of watery blue in the background of the port city. This recumbent nude, who nearly tumbles off the daybed with the piles of sumptuous fabric beneath him, is depicted as burly and muscular, would, within the logic of the early 20th century, have cast him at a distance from the feminized category of homosexuality, as we've discussed already. However, his languor and nudity, together with the appreciation of it this painting invokes, open up this probable space of homoeroticism and domestic intimacy. This takes on even greater meaning when we consider the sight of a church dome rising over the cityscape and entering the room through the window-framed vista. Here. This period in Uruguay was marked by the rise of secularism and the waning influence of the Catholic Church, and so the presence of this cupola registers these changing conceptions of the private sphere and individual freedoms. But what most captured Castellanos' imagination were otherworldly scenarios rooted in ancient Greek and Roman mythology. Here in these works, he used the stories of the self-admiring Narcissus and the ideal beauty Endymion as openings for depicting muscly and languid nudes. We can also notice how he downplayed the presence of their fabled admirers. In the case of Narcissus, the mountain nymph Echo, who blends into the rocky outcropping in the upper right, kind of hard to see. And in the sleep of Endymion, the goddess Diana, who's represented by the slightest sliver of a crescent moon, as if to make room within these compositions for another desiring gaze. Castellanos' interest in mythological worlds can also be seen in this portrait completed in Majorca, where he lived on and off beginning in 1919. The work brings together a reading figure atop a boldly striped couch, and surrounding him an imaginative dream world of Poseidon in the presence of nymphs. I was fascinated as part of my research to come across this photograph of Castellanos' home, which allows us to see how he literally painted these kinds of aquatic motifs all about its interior walls, like everywhere throughout the house. Yet in the canvas on the right, the fresco extends beyond the borders of its semicircular lunette and transmogrifies into an all-encompassing oniric vision. This collision of worlds, real and imagined, was but one popular strategy taken up by artists at this time to enact spaces of desire and self-knowing outside of the everyday pathologized meanings cast onto queer bodies. I want to conclude with the work of one final artist, the Rio de Janeiro-born Emiliano de Cavalcanti, whose works bring forward the paradoxes of reading gender and sexuality on the surface of the body. In this untitled watercolor of 1925, Di Cavalcanti depicted the cross-dressing practices taken up by putatively cisgender heterosexual revelers as part of Carnival in Brazil. These days-long festivities embraced gender-fluid self-displays and licentious exuberance as part of public spectacle, inducing relaxed periods in the policing of what would, during any other point in the year, be perceived as homosexual behaviors, intimations, or traits. Di Cavalcanti's image throws into sardonic relief the carnival-goers' compositely gendered appearances, combining hypermasculine facial features and patches of body hair with ill-fitting dresses, fanciful hats, and a pair of high heels. We can also notice how the artist registers a set of co-constitutive plays on gender and race. For example, the costume of the Afro-descendant figure on the left, with this peach-colored, long-nosed, and phallic mask, burlesques his manhood at the same moment that it makes malleable his race. As has been well studied, Carnival opened up this transient space of queer and trans possibility, wherein raucous debauchery and sensual excess could flourish on the streets, and I show here just two photographs from the 1930s in which we can glimpse these fugitive conditions. But there's another work by Di Cavalcanti of a late-night cabaret show that, in my view, thematizes the ways queer genders carried on beyond the temporal confines of Carnival. It features two glamorous performers towering over a narrow stage, their bodies joined in a close embrace. In depicting the Afro-Brazilian performer on the right, who appears scantily clad in strings of pearls or beads, the artist scribbled these coarse curls of body hair along her legs and arms, which I hope you can kind of make out. I've long wondered if this betrays an attempt to pictorialize Brazil's flexibly gendered inhabitants, albeit through highly racialized and caricatural means. And now, this posh onlooker that's seated in the lower right corner provides one clue for this figure's possible transness, with her scrutinizing cat-like gaze framed by the set of talon-like fingers. It's as if she's clocked that something's amiss, insinuating that the fantasy of gender and sexual dimorphism is something that must be visually enforced. In this work, then, much like in the photograph of the anonymous woman in Argentina, we're spoon-fed this idea that queer genders and desires are to be framed through and faded to moments of detection, thus making palpable the extent to which vision and visuality delimited what it means and feels like to embody one's gender and longings otherwise. Thank you so much.
So I wanted to start off the Q&A with a general question for our speakers, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And it comes from an urgency to rethink modernism in Latin America in light of the questions about art and sexuality that each of you raised in your presentation. So I think in the spirit of collective thinking, I was going to ask if you might comment on some of the terms that were used in each other's papers. So I'm thinking about Esther's examination of the concept of precedence and how we determine who comes first in the history of global modernism. I was also really interested in Eduardo's attention to resistance across historical time. And I'm really taken by Joseph's marshalling of inversion as a sort of subversive tactic for rethinking the work of 20th century artists, in particular in South America. So there are so many other concepts that came up in your three papers, so please feel free to address any of them. But I thought it was just a way of getting started to have each of you speak about what you said, and to really, it's a way of expressing gratitude for your interventions that help us reimagine modernism from the vantage of the global South, and inserting a place for queer people in that.
Should I start with the mic? I can start.
You look
Yeah, thank you. I really valued the ways that I hope this panel kind of put pressure on this idea of modernity, modernization as these always positivizing forces. To speak to this question of inversions, and Jesus brought this up in the introduction, there's a way in which inversion has been marshaled as a very kind of resistant tactic or strategy within a history of avant-garde or modern art from the global south. We can think of a work like a drawing by an Uruguayan artist, Joaquin Torres Garcia, in which he flips the southern continent on its head, uplifting and upending these kind of hierarchies of up, down, top, bottom, advanced, belated. And so I would think or say that our field is quite friendly and does a lot with these ideas of inversions, but it's quite curious and of course not surprising why other kinds of inversions, like a history of literal sexual inverts and their relationship to the visual, has been so cast aside or seen as kind of anathema to the kind of work that we do. So I appreciate your comments because I hope it reinforces this idea that inversion is not limited to or never separate from these kind of gender and sexual formations that, as Eduardo pointed out very well, are kind of deeply, deeply enmeshed and produced by these conditions of coloniality. Can I pass the mic to you?
Yeah, I think like talking about resistance, I always think like language is resistance, and yeah, when I brought up the words that Quechua, Aymara, and Mapangtung bring up about queerness, and thinking on language as resistance and how Latin American identities has resist to a homosexual or gay category and thinking representation, and also thinking on contemporary terms how queer scholars or queer artists are translating the queer word in English to a queer C-U-I-R word in Spanish, which is like a phonetically sounds alike, but it's like bringing up indigenous other cosmologies into the queer representation. So yeah, I think like in my presentation I will bring language as resistance.
I mean, I so appreciated these presentations. They were so wonderful, and I think that what struck me about the echoes is that, you know, each one of them felt bound to layer the carceral or the violent with the search for a kind of presentation of some other kind of potential expression of self. But it's like we can't, that repetitive rhythm of sort of like, yes, but to this sort of inversion that is not liberating. My title of the catalog is actually Liberation and Injury, right? That I felt like we were always connecting those two. And so I found sort of in the narrativizing of modernity, in abandoning that forward motion and abandoning the firstness and abandoning this idea that, you know, if we could just catch up, we would finally satisfy, right? Turns into this kind of rhythmic repetition of that return to the colonial, you know, the opposition of the colonial modernity, right? Which seems like it's supposed to, well, first comes the colonial and then comes the modern. And what Latin America critical thought keeps telling us is that, you know, modernity began with colonialism, enslavement. The idea of, you know, democracy, modern democracy began with enslavement. Capitalism was embedded on it. All of these things are part of a knot that we can't undo. And I felt like your invocation of the visual as both the, you know, site for finding these subjects and for their punishment was, you know, so telling for that, the same way that the language of indigenous peoples that continues, so that keeps getting written out by even the word that we're, you know, the exhibition celebrates, right? Puts us in that bind too. So I found them wonderful. New contributions.
Agreed. Thank you all. I want to open this up to the audience because I imagine there are questions. So there will be a microphone going around. So if you could wait for that if you have a question, and also if you could identify yourself when you ask your question, that would be great. So are there questions?
If you could share that, that would be great. I was going right by you. No, I was going to go first. Like, no, you were too.
Hi there. My name is Thaddeus Dowd. I'm a professor at Northwestern, art historian. I'll be speaking tomorrow. Thank you for this really wonderful panel. My question is directed primarily it comes from Joseph's talk, but it kind of refers to all of you. I mean, I was really struck that in all three of your talks, they sort of began, I'm thinking about the Theodore Debris or criminological photography, the disciplinarity, and I think Joseph, you really put your finger on this about like, the desire to be seen is undercut by the state's desire to force you to be seen, right? And that makes, I was very taken with that. I'm also just wondering how that coexists with the desire to be seen. Yeah. And how do we as queer people manage the, or historically, and in the case of the artists and artworks that you're looking at, how to sort of balance those two forces. This is a bit of a sort of a loose question, but I'd just be curious if this is generative for you. I'd love to hear what you think.
Sure. Start.
Yeah, thank you for those really helpful observations in that question. I mean, the case of La Otero in Argentina is a really kind of troubling illustration of this, in which we see her, I think De Vega literally describes it as her desire to figure, her desire to appear, in handing over this autobiography and in handing over these photographs. And at the same time, in De Vega's kind of preface to the article, everything that she's about to say is framed as a delusion. This is not to be taken as real. And yet, at the same time, it's the very basis for his diagnosis of her acquired sexual inversion. So there are these moments where you see him and his colleagues very much taking people at their word to reinscribe this pathologized view of them. But at the same, it's this wonky kind of, I like this idea of a knot that we've kind of brought up. I have more thoughts, but I want to hear if others want to add on.
I think Nick Merzoff has written really wonderfully about this, this problem. As much as the sort of the state saying there's nothing to be seen here when the police is enacting violence against a fellow citizen and the plantation site. So I think there's a lot that Nick's work has really contributed to this question. I mean, I think that, starting with Foucault, we learned that it's about sort of like locating who's looking at whom from where, right? And so that, perhaps the best we can do is to be narrating that and tracing that exchange of gazes and taking very seriously into account, at least what I try to do is sort of when a gaze is a violent one, when a portrayal is a communal one, when the same image can then be recirculated in ways, and then we just, as the people who write about them and account for them, where do we put our work in relationship to those images?
Yeah, I want to comment about the disciplinary, maybe like just talk about like Theodore Debris' engraving in the late 14th century and the colonial legacies of the disciplines that in Latin Americans exist. Like for example in Ecuador now, there exist the homosexualized clinics through, like family put their sons or daughters into these clinics to de-homosexualize people, right? So somehow like I think it's an echo of like what happened in the colonial period also, on how homosexual sodomites and understanding queer people has always been like through this illness or deviant way of existing, right? So they are still controlling us. In that time with dogs, now with homosexual clinics, or police, right? Like there are artists that say that the new dogs are the police, right? So something like that.
So there was a question here.
Yeah. Yes. Hello. So thank you all for the really wonderful talks. I think I've talked to all of you already. I'm Patrick. I'm doing the Japan section, or did Japanese stuff, and I'll be talking tomorrow. So I'm a total newcomer to all of this, but it's been fascinating. But one of the things, particularly just riffing off what Esther said, right, about this idea of queer rights and queer representation kind of all consistently being portrayed as a linear rat race, right? In this way that some capitals, some cultures get there first, and others don't. And I'll talk about it a little tomorrow, but in the case of Japan, right, that linearity is a real issue because there's so many ways that Japan does or does not track onto these specific metrics. But I want to think about now in the 21st century, we have so many metrics, right, by which to measure the ostensible progress of queer rights around the world. You have same-sex marriage, anti-discrimination bills, the laws that allow transgender people to change their legal gender and to have sexual gender reconfirmation surgery. All of these are legal and social ways in which they can get measured. And so the systematization is almost more easy to do than ever before. So I wanted you to think as scholars about Latin America's current position with regards to its global, think of like human rights campaigns, like how countries are doing right now, right? Like what countries have passed the most laws, what countries are passing like the most homophobic laws. And my impression, again, this is simplifying, but I'm taking advantage of the fact that we have such a global group of people here. My impression has been that Latin America is a place where legally there's been a lot of changes with regards to the rights for LGBTQ people in just the past 20 years. It's a place where it seems like, again, not to the rat race, but similar to Europe and ahead of a lot of times North America, countries in Latin America have legalized same-sex marriage, have passed anti-discrimination protections, have reduced the barriers for transgender people to transition. So imagine for you as scholars of this is a very problematic way of thinking about this, right? And I want you to think about that, whether or not you can connect these previous paradigms to what's been happening the past 20 years in Latin America and think about that contextually. Is Latin America more progressive because things have seemingly changed, at least from an outside perspective, more quickly in the past 20 years? And is that progressivism somehow anticipated in the work? Or is this entire framework a false one in which we're still having to deal with in the 21st century? And one that you feel that you might, I want to see if that's generative for you anyway.
Make the old lady answer. I think the narrative structure is one that is bound to bite us in the ass, and so in that sense of sort of like, the achievement, the sort of goal setting, the sense that, the modern, just the timeline. I do this trick with my students always, right? This idea that you're sort of moving forward and time moves in this one direction that, I guess I would say maybe if we can talk about better condition, but I do think it's important to talk about better conditions for people. And if they have improved, see how and why, right? And what can be done to continue that. And I would say in an optimistic moment, I might say, if we can take very seriously organizations that are protecting linguistic diversity, indigenous communal autonomy, different forms of property, conceptions of property beyond Western capitalism, like all of that, if we can pay attention to all of those things, which also include the possibility of different ways of understanding gender, desire, being, then yeah, we've made some real achievements. But I think Mexico on the books has had multilingual education in indigenous languages since like 1928. Mm-hmm. That's not the reality of the situation. So again, that's where we take a step back and say what's written in by the letrados, they're called in Latin America. The letrado speaks both to the writers of literature and the writers of laws, like it's the same people, right? It's the same word. They wrote that law. It doesn't really, change the society. So I think that was a long answer to yes, I think it matters what the social conditions are, but we also have to be wary of the structures that present them, right? Whether this be artistic or other.
Sure. Yeah, your question made me thought on, for example, Esther photographs on the Mexican trans woman in jail. They were like around 1930s, right?
Well, there was one set in 1895 and one set in 1925.
Yeah, for example, in Ecuador we have those photographs, but in the 90s, and that speaks about how like the legalization of homosexuality was, like depicted in every country, right? So in Ecuador, for example, it was in 1997 which is like the late 20th century. Colombia was 1979, which was 20 years earlier. And Brazil was one of the first also in Latin America, so maybe like 1930s or 1940s, I'm not sure. But then you see like these laws like also generating different representations in Latin America throughout the 20th century. So in Ecuador, you started after always after like decriminalization of homosexuality. So also how law has generated a frame in which artists are producing. That's like what I think.
Do we have enough time to keep going? Yeah, I think the paradoxes are very real and important to pay attention to. I'm quite wary of like a narration of queer progress through a like simply rights-based framework. And then I guess to cite an example, in Argentina, I think in 2012, there was a passage of a gender identity law that allowed people to change their sex marker on their identifications to T, but the T standing for transgénero, transgender, rather than an additional kind of trans femme identity known as travesti. And so there's a kind of travesti critique emerging during this moment around the very need to identify oneself with the state in the first place. And so I think even the ways that these logics of rights and inclusion have been kind of translated from a global north context into a place like Argentina creates these new kind of problems that in Argentina's kind of perpetual self-likening to like Euro-American rationality and modernity very much overlooks, in my view, I'm not Argentine, but based on Argentine travesti activists and scholars writing on this, very much kind of creates its own binds and problems.
I wonder if there's a question in the middle or the back of the room, because I'm a little low here, but yeah, so in the blue shirt.
So Joseph, your last comment. My name is David Austin. I teach at California Western School of Law. And your last comment connects somewhat to the question I had when you were talking about bailotero. I couldn't help but think of the European la bailotera, and I was wondering if you could expand on any connections. Was it a purposeful emulation? Were they in connection with each other?
She said that they were enemies, they were feuding, but the reality is that they never met one another. So it was a kind of imaginary feud. But yes, there are a lot of adoptions in these names, and these monikers of kind of popular European stage names. That's a great connection, so thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Sandra Oviedo. Born and raised in Mexico, and actually now living here and photographing the queer nightlife in Chicago. And just in the comment about the question of if Latin America is more progressive or not, I remember one person in Mexico told me like, we always live in the queer life without actually putting the label, which is like a way of living. So that was my comment. I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Could you raise your hand again? Yeah, right here in this room, in the aisle, third row.
Stephen Jones, Philadelphia and Chicago. My question is for Joseph. In the 1920s, Afro-Cuban scholar Fernando Ortiz published a Lucumí Spanish dictionary and included a word called Adodi, the people of traditional Yoruba culture, who expressed and embodied both male and female attributes, and they were considered special in the culture, and they were most highly appreciated. I was wondering, because Yoruba culture is so strong in Brazil, if you had come across any kind of similar term or label for the people who had those special qualities.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating. I have not yet, and I think that that is probably a product of the archives that I'm looking at, and not to necessarily speak of the lack of an existence of these terms circulating. So thank you for that kind of prod, which will shift my queries in the archives and which archives I'm looking at. Thank you.
I think we have time for two more.
Hi, I'm Chaz Cassidy. I went to Chicago Public Library, and I'm trained as an archivist, and so this came up, and I was wondering, you've mentioned this a few times, and I'm thinking of other sort of queer documents that we know exist but we cannot find, and I thought, would it be possible for you all to speak to sort of the gaps in the archives that you might have identified and how people do or do not fill in those gaps with different types of representation?
The process of going into certain archives and kind of looking for these figures is a very kind of disheartening one. I think I was saying to someone at a lunch we had earlier, sometimes I put in an epithet or a slur into the kind of, like a catalog record and just hold my breath and hope that nothing actually comes up. To imagine that these people were able to kind of circumvent these categories and these mechanisms that were trying to contain them. So it is, I don't know, I think a very emotional process being in the archive. Our desires to want to find and to recuperate and to rescue, but sometimes also allowing people to kind of evade our own scholarly desires for what we hope or want these people might do for us intellectually, professionally, and so on. So I don't think I hit your question like straight on the head, but that's the kind of thoughts that are coming up for me.
Yeah, maybe speaking about queer archives, two experiences Jonathan just mentioned. One experience that we have with an artist in Ecuador, Honorato Vázquez, a photographer, very queer. His images are like very queer. But we couldn't get any images in his exhibition because of his family. His family didn't want him to be presented as homosexual, which is very weird because everyone has seen his pictures and everyone knows. So it's like how we say in Spanish, un secreto a voces. I think soon he will be, right? Like the archive is already there. The archive is already out of the closet. Now it's like a matter of time. And the other one is like an Ecuadorian artist that he didn't leave his archive to his family. He lived in New Orleans. This is another period. But now I'm thinking on the importance of queer artists not leaving their archives to their families, right? It's a question, right? I think it brings a question for us as queer artists, queer archives, queer art historians, where we leave our archives, right? Who's gonna take care of them in the future? What are the policies of these archives? Who's gonna be able to show them, right? So, yeah.
I have a kind of funny other experience though, which is I sort of feel like my research is like stuff that's really obvious and that somehow nobody said, and I'm like, hey, this is right here. I mean, like Salvador Novo, like he was the leading intellectual, like he was literally the key to the city. And if you haven't read his banned autobiography that was published after his death, please do, because I mean there's no secret. There is not a secret left unsaid. And same with Mario de Andrade, who is, I think Jonathan talked about, he didn't identify for many of the reasons, both sort of racial, ethnically, he was refused to identify sexually. He didn't, but everyone knew who Mario was, and he wrote a story that was about this passionate love affair between two adolescent, sort of, it was clearly semi-autobiographical, and it's all just there. So in a sense, it's not to say there aren't important archives to be discovered, but maybe it's just a generational thing. I just sort of started with, it was like, oh wow, this is right here, right? Like, let's talk about it, and then hopefully there's also it undoes some of these hegemonic narratives enough to then find new ways to talk about the things that couldn't be on the surface in that way, maybe.
It's interesting to think about archival loss, because so much of the interesting, like, contemporary art history in the queer world is coming from archives that are under people's beds, boxes, and things in closets. The AIDS era we're learning about through personal collections, and so you wonder what we lost in the past, right? What didn't make it into a place to be preserved? So it's a great question. So we have time for one more?
One more.
Last question.
Last question over here on the...
I'll make you run
Sorry.
Hi, so my name is Eli. I am a queer artist and also run small anthology groups with queer artists. And so something that I think about, and I'm thinking about this with this tension that has come up across these talks about the definitions and the language that is being used. And we look back, and in a lot of cases, I think that we like to look back and say, hey, you know, this person back here reflects me. And there's that tension between, well, we're referring to marriage with such and such terms, even though it's changed. But then you have the cultural, like, complexity of, do you look back at these people and go, well, they wouldn't have called themselves trans, but let's call them trans. And I guess the question is how to best navigate that tension between, we don't want to be the historians going, well, they weren't gay, they wouldn't have used that word, so they must have been straight, but we also don't want to be forcing westernized concepts of gender and sexuality on people belonging to cultures that wouldn't have been seeing it that way. So I guess the question is, how do we address that and how we discuss historical contexts of queerness?
I mean, that's the question, right? You just keep asking the question. I mean, I think you learn a lot of languages, and you ask a lot of people to try and explain things to you, and you try not to think you know the answer to your own question, but you ask real questions. And I think a lot of humility, and then also networks that allow folks to speak and create knowledge and have the status of knowledge producers who don't occupy sites of privilege and English and whiteness and all of those. I mean, all of that together, maybe.
I mean, this is a question I'm super interested in, and I'm very interested in what it means for us to look at and know somebody's anything. And what I wanted, or what kind of occurred to me that I was trying to do in preparing this talk, is to say that this idea that we can look and know somebody's body through sight alone was constructed and fabricated and disseminated and circulated and then rendered natural. And so I think that even looking at ourselves, and like you very like perfectly kind of summed up, like asking why is it that we need to kind of pin down somebody's identity? What is that motivated by? And I think we know why. We kind of have been made to feel as some kind of ahistorical category, and yet is that not in some ways kind of reproducing this problem that we might, or might not, but might want to evade altogether?
So I'm gonna try to say something. What I think is, like, for example, in the case of indigenous queer artists and images that have arrived from the colonial times about indigenous people. In my practice, I work with indigenous contemporary artists, so they are linked to their ancestors and to their practices and to their territories, right? So that's how we engage with our memories and our archives. Archives are not always in the institutions or under the bed, as you said. They are also in oral history, and I think that's important to redefine our identities all the time. And yeah, I think identity is not a fixed thing. Today I was reading my text and I went to a pronoun of an artist and I was like, fuck, I put him, sorry about that word. And I should use them. And I was like, oh, you know, those things that are you always thinking as a scholar and also as a queer person. We want to queer identity, we don't want to make it fixed, so.
I mean, I think just real quick, I mean, we did this in English, but Spanish is registering this very actively right now in terms of using les or in the US it's different. Oftentimes you'll see, most of you have probably seen Latinx, but that's really hard to say for native Spanish speakers, so it's more often the E, so it's, you know, so and there's different, that's differentiated as well, so it's not just pronoun, but that pervades your whole way of speaking, and then when do you choose to use those endings and when not, so it's in the flow right now.
So we're gonna have a few words from our hosts at Brightwood, but I want to say first, let's give another round of applause for
I just want to end this evening with gratitude. Gratitude first to our panelists and our speakers this evening, those who are here with us to speak tomorrow. Gratitude to Jonathan and Johnny for convening this group of people. Gratitude to the Alliance Francaise for hosting us, to Jean. I want to give special gratitude to Melissa Terrell at Alphawood. With that, literally half a year. Many of you just never have made it. So thank you, Melissa, for everything you do. And just gratitude for community. It is a dark time, and I think it is so important to be in community, to be in community, especially with scholarship, underline that community, and to just be together and to explore these issues and to keep speaking, to keep asking questions, to keep pursuing art and beauty and togetherness. So I think we should feel gratitude for our being together tonight, and with that, celebrate that gratitude with some champagne and dessert. And we'll